My name is Russ Altman. I'm on the far left. We're going to talk about a year in review, kind of, for AI, some things that have caught our attention. We have 7 minutes. Where's the timer? Good. And I guess I'm going to get going. So we've divided up into different areas, and the area that I've been assigned to is the central dogma, AI and the central dogma, which is directly related to the discussion you just heard about. And thank you, Eric, for the promise in basic science. So I'm going to talk about the central dogma. So I will remind you, DNA in the genome goes to RNA, and the transcriptome goes to protein, that goes to function. I know that some of you are having, frights from your college or medical school or whatever, graduate school. But the function is the beginning of where you start to think about normal physiology and disease. So I just want to tell you some things that have happened and that are happening that's a cause for amazing excitement. Next slide. Oh, I can do that too, but I like saying next slide. So here's the big one. Here's the TLDR. You know that Hassabis and Jumper and at the DeepMind company, a part of Google, were awarded the Nobel Prize for protein structure prediction using AI methods. This was a problem that I thought I would die with it being unsolved, and this was amazing. And I don't think you should be surprised if AI plus humans continues to win Nobel Prizes in all fields of science. First one. Second one, foundation models. These things like large language models, they are big neural network models of biological data, usually high throughput because they're data hungry. They are getting bigger and better. In all of those areas of the central dogma that I previously mentioned, the DNA genomics, the transcriptomics, everything. We'll look at some data in a moment. And then agent systems, and you heard about the tumor board. That's like a bunch of agents with their special expertise. Those systems, that's a good idea. It's a good idea to have teams with different expertise. And as we just heard, you can make these AI systems have multiple expertises. You can have them argue with one another. They can come to decisions. That we're starting to see very exciting systems design experiments, design research programs that then can be implemented, sometimes by humans, sometimes by robots. So next, let me see if I can figure out how to do this. Great. So I love this slide. It was made in 2008, and it's DNA availability over time, and it was like a straight line. And straight lines like that, exponentials, they don't usually last. But that only was 2008, and guess what? This is 2024. It really did last. In fact, the plot that I just showed you is a flat line on this graph, the data up to 2008. So in DNA, and then because DNA encodes for proteins, in proteins, we have unbelievable amounts of data. And that is what's fueling AI now. There are future challenges because there are parts of biology that are not amenable to high throughput, where the AI challenge is what we call low shot or few shot learning, where you're building systems with less data than you would love to have. These are databases, you don't care about them. Okay, so this is exciting to me. What we have at the top are the protein sequences. These are the fundamental units of life, big molecules, beautiful molecules. You may have seen them. Hundreds of millions of them that we knew about for the last 5 years, but which, based on experimental data, we only had good understanding of the 3D structure and function for this very small, valuable set of data. With the accomplishments of DeepMind and other systems, we now, all of a sudden, as of this year, have a pretty good working model for every one of those proteins that we had nothing for 4 or 5 years ago. And that has fueled a bunch of things we'll be speaking about, but it's important. So it's the growth of the experimental data and the growth of the predicted data. Let's just acknowledge the experimental data is what fed into the AI systems that then allowed the predicted data to exist. So that's an important principle of AI, is the data that you collect that's expensive and painful can best be used by these foundation-type models. I'm going to call DeepMind the AlphaFold a foundation model, to then get to remarkably increased understanding. So when what we think about in protein science are protein language models. These are just like ChatGPT, but they don't do English words. They take the amino acid building blocks of proteins, and they generate proteins. You heard a little discussion about synthetic proteins. These are like the ChatGPT of proteins. And we have millions and millions of molecules that we can feed in, and we can build these models. And just like for ChatGPT and its competing models, they started out small and pathetic, and they're getting big and with amazing power for looking at structure, understanding what it's going to do, being able to design structures that do new things. By the way, I should have said before, all of this comes from the AI Index chapter 20. So AI Index is released every year by HAI. The 2025 version, chapter 5, was about science, and these are stolen from that report, which we helped produce. This again shows that the models are getting better, and they're not just getting bigger. The last slide showed you that they're getting bigger. They're getting better. This is the performance of protein language models at predicting the structure and function of protein sequences that they have never seen before and that are novel. And so we could kind of do that a while back, and now we're getting very good at it. The performance is up around 65% of the time, kind of nailing it. When you look at the field of protein structure, we're seeing a lot in protein function. When you look at the literature, where is AI happening? Function prediction is number one for proteins. Structure prediction is actually getting a little bit less attention because we're in pretty good shape. Protein-drug interactions, how do drugs work? Can we design new proteins with new functions for bioremediation in the environment and for treating our patients at the hospital? Now, I want to end up in the last 40 seconds. I promised I would end on time, with some of the emerging areas. So microscopy, we take pictures of cells. You heard about histology earlier. The number of foundation models and systems dealing with the automatic analysis of clinical images of cells is exploding. The same thing that happened with protein sequences and the genomes is starting to happen with transcriptomes. These are, in a cell, what are the genes that are actually active and doing stuff? We have 20,000 genes. We don't use them all the time. We're beginning to have ChatGPTs for how cells work. And finally, we're starting to have agents that do biology. They design experiments. They recommend that we run them. They ask us to tell them the results, and then they help us design the next set of experiments. So this has been a brief show of the leading indicators of the impacts on medicine are the discoveries, and it's looking good. I want to thank the students who worked on this report, and thank you for your attention.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Curt Langlotz. I'm on the faculty here in the medical school, and it's great to see the engagement with Raise Health here in the room and across the board. Russ and I did not compare notes, but actually the themes in our two presentations are very similar. So looking forward to that. If I could have my first slide, do I just, thank you. So I'm going to talk about what we've learned in a year in medical imaging. And it's really an area that we have, that's been leading the implementation of AI in the clinical setting. Headlines up front. So imaging is leading the way in clinical AI in terms of the number of models that are actually implemented in a clinical setting. Medical imaging presents unique challenges, which we'll talk about, and that has to do with the data structure that we use. High quality data remains a bottleneck, and then foundation models, just what Russ was talking about. So this is a plot of the number of models that have been cleared by the FDA over time. You can see rapid growth. This is through 2023. And if you look at the areas that those models target, over 3/4 of them are targeting radiology. And if you add in ophthalmology, pathology, gastroenterology, all the other imaging specialties, it's over 85% that are targeting images. So very interesting growth in imaging. And there's an industry out there. So this is just to give you a sense. This is the logos of the over 100 companies that were exhibiting at a recent radiology professional meeting. All these companies are selling radiology AI algorithms to radiology practices. This is from an NIH consensus conference in 2018, looking at what are the needs, what are the bottlenecks when it comes to AI research and imaging. And the problem is mostly small data sets lacking in real-world variation. We've made some progress on that, but that is still true today. Just to give you a sense, a lot of the work that pioneered AI and imaging outside of medicine was done on something called ImageNet, 15 million images. They were 224 pixels by 224 pixels. And you've probably seen these models that you can say, show me a hippopotamus in a lily pond in the style of Van Gogh, and you get an image that looks like this. That's 1024 by 1024. That's about the size of a single slice of a CT. Of course, our CTs have hundreds of slices, and that's just before we administer the intravenous contrast. Then we have during the intravenous contrast images. We have after the intravenous contrast images. If this were an MR, it might be 30 sequences instead of 3. And then we have to compare to the prior. And then we have to cross-correlate, as Russ said, multimodal. Or Eric said, multimodal, right? We have the electronic health record data. So a lot of complex, interesting research questions are being addressed just because of the complexity and multimodal nature of our data, and that includes imaging. We really tried to address this imaging problem here at Stanford. We have a program that makes data widely available to other laboratories. So we've now made available 23 data sets, including a large data set of 225,000 chest x-rays and their reports that's used as a common benchmark for early imaging research. And we now have a program that allows those data sets to be licensed for commercial use as well. But that's not really solving the problem, because if you look at where the data sets are coming from that are training imaging models out in the literature today, this was done a few years ago, published in JAMA, they're coming from just 3 states, Massachusetts, New York, and California. So the models that we're training, because of the generalizability issues here, aren't necessarily getting the right answer for Idaho and Minnesota and Florida. And so we need other solutions, and that's where you're starting to see things like this Medical Imaging and Data Resource Center. So this is a large, expensive project funded by the NIH and ARPA-H to collect in an intentional way diverse data from across the country and aggregate the data. So this system has now aggregated over 500,000 imaging data sets. This started with COVID. It's now branching out to other disease states. So expensive, but a good way to bring together a large, diverse data set that we can build models that have the right answer for broad populations. Okay, foundation models, very important. So medical imaging data has this unique property that we have both the images and the text description, the report that an expert made at the time that that image was created. And so here, just you look at the years here, these are all the publications that have happened, and this data is also drawn from the High AI Index publication that Russ mentioned. So we have diffusion models, those that create images from text descriptions, large vision language models that are these multimodal text vision models, 2D image-only models or multi-scale image models that are done for pathology data. And then this is just another look at that data. If you look across, what specialties are these addressing in imaging? So a lot of work going on here. And I'm just going to take a minute to tell you about 2, PathChat and ChecksAgent. So PathChat is this study. This is Faisal Mahmood out of Harvard. You show it an image, and you can ask it a question. Say, please give a morphologic description of this region as well as the whole slide. It'll say the region depicted is a section of colon tissue featuring marked inflamed lamina propria, lymphoid aggregate with a germinal center, et cetera, et cetera. So these systems are getting very good, and this has now been through the FDA clearance process to describe what's happening on a pathology slide, getting back to Eric's PATH system from many years ago. And this is ChecksAgent. This is out of here at Stanford. This is trained on 8 million chest x-rays. And you can see performance on the y-axis here, the red bars. When you train on large amounts of data, you get much better performance. And that's kind of the ChatGPT effect there. The blue bars are other previously published models. This has now been reproduced multiple times. And you can see the different problems that we use to benchmark it. So view classification, visual question answering, image text reasoning. So things like drafting radiology reports that can really help us with our workflow. Just want to close with this thought, which is that I think we are about to have a kind of ChatGPT moment in this area. If you look at the size of the training data, which is thought to be related to how accurate these models perform, of the largest data sets inside medicine versus outside medicine. So inside medicine, the purple bars, 82 billion, this is text, versus 15 trillion. So this is a 100x difference. There's a gap there in terms of medical and non-medical data. Same in images. Non-medical imaging versus medical imaging, again, 100x gap. We can fill that gap even with the data from a single health system. So this is just plotting the Stanford healthcare data. So I think And we're just starting to we're working on this problem. There are many others working on this problem, growing the size of the training data sets. And when we start to see models that are trained using these self-supervision methods that were used to train ChatGPT, but they were trained on lots of high-quality medical data, we're going to see some really interesting things happen in the next few years. With that, I will close and hand it over to Natalie.
Thank you, Curt. Continuing to build on the themes that have been talked about so far, I get to talk about AI in clinical medicine in the non-radiology space. So for those of you who don't know me, I am Natalie Pageler. I'm the Chief Health Informatics Officer at Stanford Medicine Children's Health, as well as a pediatric critical care physician. And I'm going to start with a paper that's a little bit older than a year. Back in 2009, Chuck Friedman wrote this paper on the fundamental theorem of biomedical informatics, which essentially says that man plus machine will always be better than either man or machine alone. It's a great paper still, and several of the corollaries in there definitely still hold true today. But in the last year, we've been seeing a lot of studies, or at least news articles about studies suggesting some serious challenges to that fundamental theorem. And so here are a few of the splashy headlines that hit the news this year. And several of these headlines are based on studies done here. So Ethan Go and Jonathan Chen and Eric Horvitz and team produced a couple of the studies which looked at the interactions of humans and AI on clinical reasoning and decision-making. But there are a handful of other studies across the country that really showed some surprising interactions and outcomes when you looked at how physicians interacted with AI, and suggested that maybe that fundamental theorem needs to be called into question. Now, of course, there are lots of limitations, and these are just looking at a slice of what happens in clinical care. So many of these studies were based on vignettes that relied on physical exam findings from a physician or questions that had been asked through the history taking from a physician, but still they begged a lot of questions. Now, these interactions of humans and machines are not new questions. And I love, again, another older paper. This is a fun 2014 article in the Wall Street Journal. I like it for a few different reasons. One, the title's great. Two, it starts with the sentence, "Artificial intelligence is here," emphasizing that we have continued to evolve in our understanding and our definitions of artificial intelligence. But what I really like about it is that it compares artificial intelligence and human interactions across multiple settings, including aviation, and talks about concepts like automation bias and automation complacency, and how humans sometimes inappropriately over-rely on these systems depending on a series of different factors, like the context, like their experience levels, like their trust in the system itself. And so it gives us a few clues for what we need to look at as we continue to think about how humans should interact with these systems. In one of the recent studies that those flashy headlines were based on by Nikhil Agarwal and team, they also defined a term called automation neglect, where a particularly experienced physician may choose to reject helpful information from an AI system because they are so strongly held in their own beliefs about their experience and their knowledge. So again, lots of questions about how we can inform the clinical pathways, the clinical systems to get to the best outcomes from these interactions between physicians and AI going forward. So still lots of work to be done there before you walk into your robot doctor. But there are a few places where we are already seeing dramatic impacts of AI on clinical medicine. And you've heard this one described a few times today. So the impact of AI scribes on physicians and physician workflows. Again, I will highlight that several of these studies are taken from the AI Index. So please go there and you can see more details and a more comprehensive review than I can do in 7 minutes. But this study was done by one of our clinical informaticists here at Stanford, Stephen Ma and team, and showed significant savings in time writing notes, in time working after hours, really showing that maybe we can undo some of that significant impact of documentation burden that physicians have been experiencing for so many years. This is a great, again, referring back to some of our older papers, but this is a great article from 2012 where you see the family happily sitting at the end of the exam table and the physician with their back to the family typing away at a computer. And maybe we are starting to undo this with AI. But again, here's where some of the questions remain. We have yet to study how the use of these AI scribes may affect physician thinking. Will there be bias introduced when it selects what is important to pay attention to? And do we know how it will impact the physician and patient relationship? We have a few anecdotal stories saying that patients and families really do appreciate not having the computer between them and the physician. How many of you have gone to an appointment where you've seen this used in real life? Yeah? A very different experience, right? Suddenly they are not typing away. Suddenly they might be able to look at you in the eyes. And so that has the potential to dramatically improve that connection between physician and patient that we know is so important. And yet, we have yet to study whether every patient and family will accept this. Will there be differences for people of different backgrounds and based on their trust in the AI systems? So again, lots more work to do. The good news is there is lots of work going on. So this is the number of clinical trials that have been done each year that include mentions of AI significantly improving. And then finally, again, this is a different version of that chart on FDA authorizations of AI and ML-enabled medical devices. And as Curt just said, we continue to see that dramatically increasing. But again, I'll call out the questions that remain in the disparities of the target populations. So this chart includes not only the number that were approved across the board, but also the number of AI and ML-enabled medical devices that were specifically labeled for pediatrics. So as a pediatrician, I of course have to call out the places where we are falling behind in applications across the age spectrum. And while there are a handful that are getting specifically labeled for pediatrics, when you look at the information behind them, only 18% specifically described the pediatric populations that they validated that data in. And a large number don't use any pediatric data for validation, even though they're labeled for kids. So again, just speaking to the incredible work that we need to do to make sure that our AI tools are applicable, safe, meaningful across all of our populations. Thanks. And with that, I will hand it off to our last speaker.
I am Sanmi Koyejo, faculty in computer science. I lead a lab that thinks about trust and safety in AI systems with a focus on applications to healthcare and science. So my job over the next few minutes to close this out is to think a bit or deeper dive on some of the same questions we've been asking about what's happened over the last year, but we'll focus a little bit on fairness and equity questions. So there's been an incredible amount of work over the past year, as in previous years. There, I think, has been great consensus building work in the ecosystem. So for instance, there's a future AI paper that's worth a quick look that talks about guiding principles in building better AI systems, includes folks in this room as co-authors. And parts of the guiding principles includes fairness, again, highlighting how much effort is now being paid and how much attention is being paid to fairness and equity questions. There's work from Stanford and many other places thinking about what it means on the healthcare building side, but also what policy implications might look like and how to think about policy. There is, however, a growing recognition that AI bias might reflect deeper systemic healthcare and other kinds of inequities, and I'll spend a couple of minutes deep diving into this because I think it's interesting in a way that I don't think we understood as well a few years ago. There was a paper I wrote with some colleagues, again, some of the folks here as well, where we did a survey of what kinds of work was happening in healthcare AI circa mid-2024. And I think some of the most interesting observations included that only 5% of papers actually use real patient data. So there were lots of big pronouncements made, but a vast majority of the work that was being done was using exam questions. You might have seen that a ton. I think people are really excited about AI systems passing various kinds of medical exams. Clinician-designed vignettes, other kinds of expert-generated questions. I mean, of course, this is a hard issue for various reasons, including privacy, but there certainly is a gap if you don't include patient data in how you're evaluating and thinking about AI systems. The vast majority of the work focuses on simple metrics like accuracy. A small fraction, though, we think increasing, around 16% think about bias and fairness in their work. I think some of what is maybe interesting and what is changing and has been discussed a few times today is a lot of the work focuses directly on things like diagnosis, but some of what we noticed is that maybe some of the biggest gaps and the biggest opportunities for meaningful change were tied to questions that were around things like administrative work, so things that are high overhead, lead to burnout, but easily mitigated potentially with AI systems. And we've seen some of this with some of the voice systems that we've talked about a few times today. Some interesting papers I saw, there was one I thought was quite interesting, thinking about equitable healthcare. So this paper looked into EGFR, which is a kidney function measurement. And circa 2021, there was a change made that removed the correction tied to race. And this was done because it was noticed that this correction was inappropriate for various reasons. And so this was a re-reflection of the literature to try to fix some gaps that had been found. Some of what was most interesting, so in the population that was studied, there were quite meaningful changes. So, for instance, in Black patients, the EGFR values decreased 10% on average based on the change. So kidney function measurements change. And so because of this, 18% were retriaged into more severe cases. And so could potentially get more treatment because it was better recognized that they were sort of in a more critical stage of kidney function. However, some of, I think, what was interesting, notice on the other side of this is, well, also lots of things didn't change. And I think most striking that was not changed was actually the long-term or mid to long-term actual impact. So outcomes of the patients actually didn't change despite this algorithmic change. And so what I think we're learning from this is algorithms are part of a solution, but can't be all of it. In fact, we need systemic change around how we build our sort of healthcare ecosystems in order to have meaningful change that actually impacts patients in a long-term and meaningful way. Another interesting version of this work, this is more qualitative, but done thinking about, in this case, in the pain area, but I wanted to mention it as sort of an interesting alternative view here, qualitative. But I think the key takeaways here are similar, that again, technical solutions are part of the target ways that we can move the needle, but we need more. We really do need the ecosystem to engage in these questions. One paper that I found quite interesting was from some colleagues that looked at measurements. So as you might also know, our field is quite enamored by what it means to measure AI systems, and specifically think about leaderboards, so ranking these systems on sort of publicly accessible boards that tell you number 1 through 5 or something. And what this paper looks at is specifically fairness leaderboards, and their key takeaway in the analysis was that fairness can be highly contextual. So it depends on the patient and their context, and looking at a single fairness ranking loses so much of the context that makes this problem interesting and important. And so what they propose, and I think is interesting, and some of the more recent work has been engaging in this style of work, is instead of a single sort of context-free fairness score, perhaps we can build what they call benchmark suites. So this is a way to better contextualize the behavior of the AI models for different patient populations, for different deployment contexts, so that, say, you as a decision maker can now make a decision not based on a sort of generic rank score, but can actually focus on the scores that matter and the context and application that you care about the most. And so benchmark suites might be an interesting way to try to solve for that problem. So we've learned a ton. We've learned about better ways to think about potential more standardization. Much more work should be done with real patient data. There's a lot more potential for high impact and clear ROI around administrative tasks and other tasks that are not as directly related to sort of care or diagnosis delivery directly. More change is needed. Some of the work includes thinking broadly about healthcare inequities, not just bias. Thinking about various ways to engage with failure modes and other ways we can think about technical solutions paired with structural healthcare reforms that can achieve meaningful equity improvements. I'll end here. I wanted to call out a op-ed I wrote in The Guardian last year. It focuses on race because I think it's one of the most salient angles around which we think about equity, but I think is meaningfully relevant to many other directions over which we might think about ways to improve our healthcare systems. And it thinks broadly around the ways the algorithmic systems might actually be an advantage instead of disadvantage when we want to think about better equitable systems in the world, AI systems in the world more broadly. Thanks, Russ, and Natalie, and Curt for the great presentations.